Picture this. It's 2:17 a.m. on a wind-swept railway siding in Marseille, France. The Mistral wind is so strong it screams, covering all other sounds. A single high-security mail car, Voiture 7, sits isolated on a dark track, carrying 30 million francs in undeclared Corsican money, disguised as official postal cash. In exactly 12 minutes, Julien Dubois will execute the most perfect heist in the history of the French underworld. He'll steal the 30 million, disappear without a trace, and frame 4 innocent co-workers for his crime. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. The Corsican mafia, who control the depot, will never know they were robbed by their own signalman. They'll torture and murder the wrong people, destroy innocent families, and never suspect that the man who fixed their jammed track switches was the same man who stole their fortune. This is the true story of the perfect crime and the terrible price of perfection. How far would you go to escape a life of being invisible? And what happens when the perfect plan has the most imperfect consequences? Let me take you back to where it all began. 2 years before that windy night, Julien Dubois was nobody, literally nobody. At 36 years old, he was the kind of person society had trained itself not to see. An electrician and signalman for the SNCF at the Saint-Charles Postal Depot, earning 300 francs a day, roughly $60, to maintain the ancient, failing electrical grid for the very tracks that carried millions. Julien had worked in the Saint-Charles rail yard for 3 years, mopping up water from flooded conduits, replacing burned-out relays, fixing jammed track switches. To the freight handlers and the armed postal guards, he was furniture, invisible, forgettable. But furniture has eyes, and furniture has ears. During his first year, Julien heard everything. While rewiring a junction box near the loading bay, he'd overhear hushed conversations about special cargo. While fixing the lights in the supervisor's office, he'd listen to logistics meetings. While emptying electrical panels, he'd absorb details about routes, schedules, and security procedures for one car in particular, Voiture 7. The conversation that changed his life happened on a Tuesday in July, while he was fixing a faulty signal lamp on the far side of the yard. He heard the depot's unofficial overseer, a Corsican enforcer named Bastia, explaining a recurring problem. The shunting engine they used to move Voiture 7 from the main line to the secure vault was old. Its driver was a union man, reliable, but slow. The route across the yard was a 10-minute blind spot, with no cameras and minimal oversight. Bastia laughed as he explained their solution. The manifest for Voiture 7 was always sealed, marked State Secrets, and handled by only one engineering crew. The driver was under orders to never stop, no matter what. Any delay was a security breach. Julien continued working, his expression never changing, but inside his mind was calculating. 30 million francs every month, a 10-minute blind spot, one driver. What if that train was simply forced to stop? But Julien wasn't a criminal. He was an electrician with a technical degree who'd never stolen anything larger than a spool of copper wire. How could someone like him rob the Corsican mafia? The answer came 11 months later, when fate handed him the key to everything. In June of the following year, a massive power surge during a thunderstorm fried the main switching controller for the entire postal yard. The system was dead. Trains were backing up, and the Corsicans' monthly shipment was due in 48 hours. They needed someone, anyone, who understood the depot's ancient 1970s relay system. Someone pointed to Julien. The signalman had fixed the main breaker before, hadn't he? Julien nodded quietly. He taught himself advanced electrical engineering from old textbooks, practicing on discarded equipment. It was a hobby, nothing more. But as he worked on the switching controller, bypassing the fried modern boards and manually rewiring the old relays, Julien realized he'd been handed something far more valuable than money: access. The yard's entire physical infrastructure ran through this one controller. Track switches, signal lights, power grids, even the magnetic locks on the sidings, everything was connected. And now Julien had the master schematic. For the next 6 months, Julien became the depot's unofficial ghost. Every technical problem, every signal fault, every power failure. They called the signalman. He was reliable, quiet, and completely invisible. What they didn't know was that Julian was documenting everything, every vulnerability, every bypass, every blind spot in the grid. He learned he could create a signal fault that would force a train to stop at a specific point on the track. He learned he could remotely trigger a track switch from a trackside junction box, diverting a car without anyone in the control room knowing. He could make the yard's electronic systems show whatever he wanted them to show. Julian was no longer just a signalman. He was a ghost, moving invisibly through the yard's nervous system, learning its secrets, preparing for something they could never imagine. But knowledge without action is worthless. Julian needed more than access. He needed a plan, and that plan began taking shape in his small, damp apartment in Le Panier, under the light of a single lamp. What followed were 18 months of meticulous preparation that would have impressed military strategists and terrified psychiatrists. If you could have seen Julian's apartment in December of that year, you would have thought you'd walked into the mind of a madman or a genius. Every wall was covered with rail yard schematics, train schedules, photographs, and flowcharts. Red string connected junction boxes to track numbers, routes to personnel, patterns to opportunities. It looked like the workspace of a detective hunting a serial killer, not an electrician planning a robbery. But Julian wasn't crazy. He was methodical. The turning point came while Julian was sitting in a small cafe near the old port, sheltering from the rain. He was tired, his hands raw from pulling copper wire. The pain was instant, sharp, numbing, hot. The television in the corner was old, flickering, mounted high on the wall. Julian wasn't paying attention at first, but then came the line, spoken by a British historian. In every great heist, the real genius isn't the one who steals the money. It's the one smart enough to make someone else take the fall. Julian looked up. The documentary explained how the real masterminds never got caught. They let the foot soldiers rot in prison or disappear. They didn't just steal, they erased themselves from the story. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He replayed that phrase over and over in his mind. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about after the money, about who would be blamed. By dawn, he had a new plan, one more dangerous, more brilliant than anything he'd imagined before. He opened a clean page in his notebook and wrote 2 words: scapegoat. Redirection. The robbery would happen, but someone else would pay for it. The next few weeks were obsessive. He stole personnel files one by one and spread them out on his bed. He took notes in a stolen ledger, assigning threat scores, psychological traits, personal risks. He wasn't looking for flaws. He was looking for stories that would make someone look guilty. Pascal Renoir showed up by accident. One night, while taking a smoke break behind the depot, Julian noticed a familiar car parked down the dark alley. Inside, Pascal, a freight handler, in the passenger seat. With him was a woman, young, beautiful, definitely not his wife. They were kissing fast, nervous. Julian lingered a second longer than he should have. Not because he was shocked, but because he knew her. He had seen her before, on the arm of Bastia, the Corsican enforcer. She was Bastia's mistress. Julian had just found his first crack. Next came Mathieu Gallo. Julian had seen him a few times near the break room, always pacing, always jittery, like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. One night, while fixing a flickering light, Julian overheard Mathieu on the payphone. He kept repeating the same line. "The money's coming, I swear. Just a few more days." His voice cracked halfway through. Julian didn't know who was on the other end or what the debt was about, but he didn't need to. Fear like that had a shape. A few quiet questions to a friendly bartender confirmed it. Mathieu owed a fortune to local Corsican loan sharks. Then there was Alain Bernard. Julian kept running into him in the union office, break rooms, and every time Alain had questions. Too many questions. Why is Voiture 7's manifest always sealed? Who signed off on the new security protocol? Where exactly is this car's cargo going? He wasn't loud, just persistent. Julien once overheard him in the locker room grilling a supervisor for 10 straight minutes about the sealed manifest. That night, Julien wrote his name in a notebook and circled it twice in red. Next to it he scribbled, "Too many questions." Then there was Luc Moreau, too perfect, always early, always quiet, always followed the rules. Among a crew full of screw-ups, men who drank too much, gambled, skipped steps just to get home faster, Luc stood out. He didn't party. He didn't slack off. He did everything by the book. And that, in a place like this, was its own kind of suspicious. Luis noticed it, wrote his name down, underlined it. Sometimes the ones who don't fit in are the ones people start whispering about. But the final piece was different. Stéphane Joly, the engineer who drove the shunting engine. The kind of man no one suspects. He brought lunch from home, checked his engine twice, called his wife after every shift. Too perfect. Julien had almost moved on, until he saw the line in the medical file he'd snuck from the HR office. Chronic insomnia. Prescription, Zolpidem. He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he just stared at the ceiling fan. Then he stood up, walked over to the wall where all the threads were pinned, workers, routes, dates, habits, and stood silently in front of it, not moving, just thinking. Julien lit a cigarette, then another. By the time the sun rose, he hadn't moved. But in his mind, the story had already begun, and these men, Pascal, Mathieu, Alain, even Luc, they were no longer co-workers. They were pieces, and he was ready to arrange them. Julien didn't own a computer. He barely finished his technical degree. But he had two things most men in that depot didn't: patience and invisibility. No one notices the signalman. That was his power. While they laughed, smoked, argued, bragged, Julien was in the background, listening, collecting. And once he had the names circled in red, he began the slow, silent work of turning suspicion into certainty. He started with Pascal. The kiss had been fast, but the woman's face stuck in Julien's mind. A week later, he saw them again, at a small cafe near the port. This time, he was ready. He had a small camera. He sat 2 tables away, hidden behind a newspaper. Click. A single photo. Pascal and Bastia's mistress holding hands. Julien didn't need to know why. He just needed the proof. Mathieu was harder. He didn't leave clues. He leaked anxiety. But Julien had seen enough panicked men to recognize the patterns, so he watched. He rewired a junction box slowly near the payphone where Mathieu always paced. He started showing up there at the same time every shift, lingering. One night, he overheard enough to confirm it. "The money's coming. I swear. Don't do anything stupid. Just wait." The call ended with Mathieu nearly in tears. The next day, Julien quietly asked one of the older freight handlers, "That Mathieu guy, what's his deal?" The answer came with a snort. "Guy blew his inheritance at the track. Owes serious money to Bastia's cousins, I heard. Stupid bastards got death on a timer." Julien didn't ask again. He didn't need to. With Alain, Julien barely had to dig. The man talked too much, questioned everything. But the key wasn't Alain's mouth. It was how everyone else reacted to it. Julien started fixing relays closer to the union office. He noticed how supervisors tensed, how drivers rolled their eyes, how the Corsican guards shifted in their seats. Then one afternoon in the loading bay, Julien heard 2 guards whispering near a stack of crates. "If that Alain keeps pushing about Voiture 7, he's going to fall in the harbor." Bastia already flagged him, asking about manifests like he's a customs agent. Julien didn't even blink. He just kept twisting a wire, turned the corner, and wrote Alain's name twice in his notebook. This time, no question marks. Luc was the strange one. Too polite, too clean, never late, never loud, never careless. While others cursed or joked or got drunk after work, Luc walked straight to the bus stop and went home. That's what made him dangerous. Then one evening, while Julian was restocking a first aid kit in the men's break room, Luke walked in and started venting, not to Julian, but more to himself. They think I'm trying too hard, just because I don't screw around like the rest of them. I'm the only one doing things right, and all I get is silence. I'm invisible to them. Then he looked at Julian, suddenly realizing he wasn't alone, and said, "You get it. You're just an electrician. You do your job. No one sees it." He washed his hands, shook his head, and left. Julien stood there for a full minute, motionless, then walked to the corner, opened his notebook and wrote down, "Luc Moreau, too perfect, wants to be seen." That was it. That was enough. By the end of the month, Julian had built his internal case file. 4 men, 4 stories, not lies, just vulnerabilities. All he had to do now was connect the right evidence to the right crack. He didn't need hackers or police records. He had wiring diagrams, overheard gossip, port-side memory, and instincts sharpened by years of being ignored. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. It was a stage, and the roles had already been cast. The night after Julian finalized his list, the 4 men he would frame, he found himself in a smoky bar in the old port. The place was almost empty. A flickering television played a football match nobody watched. The bartender poured pastis like time didn't matter. Julian sat alone with a warm drink, staring at the wall, thinking. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't on how to steal. They were on how to disappear. The heist was only half the plan. The rest, the part that really mattered, was making sure Julien Dubois died that night too. Quietly, without a trace. But how does a signalman vanish? He had no access to hackers, no corrupt officials. No one owed him favors. He wasn't a smuggler or a soldier or a man with resources. He was just the guy who fixed the lights. And then, by accident, he heard something. 2 men were talking at the table behind him. Low voices, careful words, a thick Corsican accent. One of them mentioned documents, clean scans, multiple IDs, and a name that stuck, Le Fantôme. Julien didn't turn around. He didn't breathe. He just listened, memorized the details, let the names settle into his bones. When one of the men left, Julien waited a full minute, then got up and offered the other man a drink. No questions, just presence. Something about his quiet intensity must have worked, because by the time the second pastis was done, Julien had a meeting place and a time. A week later, in the back of a shuttered bouchon in Lyon, he met the man behind the name. No real introductions, no handshakes. Le Fantôme didn't ask who Julien was or why he needed to disappear. He simply got to work. His movements were clean, practiced, part craftsman, part surgeon. Julien explained what he needed. A life that had never worked for the railroad, never lived in Marseille, and had just enough digital noise to seem boring and real. For 50,000 francs, quietly siphoned over months from inflated electrical supply invoices, he got it. Name, Marc Fournier. Origin, a town in the Alps, where the municipal archives had burned down in 1987. Background, school records from a closed lyceum. Job history from a now-defunct shipping company. Noise, 2 parking violations, a small unpaid utility bill, just enough to show up on second-rate databases. 2 weeks later, Julien held a fresh French passport and a valid Portuguese driver's license, both under his new identity. He also received a floppy disk filled with scanned records, ID backups, certificates, the kind of details only a bureaucrat would check. He stared at them that night under a flickering bulb in his apartment. The heist hadn't happened yet, but the man who would pull it off, he already didn't exist. Let's go back to the day Julien read Stéphane's medical file. He wasn't looking for weakness. He was looking for a story he could weaponize. And there it was, a quiet sentence tucked away at the bottom. Medical leave, chronic insomnia. Prescription, Zolpidem. Julien stopped reading. His thoughts froze, not from confusion, but from clarity. Sedatives. That changed everything. It meant Stefan was already living under chemical control. He didn't need to be scared, threatened, or bribed. He just needed to be put to sleep. Julian stared at the file for over an hour that night, and as the idea settled into his mind, it no longer felt like a detail. It felt like the plan. But theory wasn't enough. Julian needed a way to do it silently, quickly, without leaving a mark. He started digging. First, he called his cousin, a welder at the Marseille shipyards. He pretended to be writing a screenplay, asking questions about ship maintenance. What kind of gas do you use to fight fires in engine rooms? Is it fast? Does it smell? Could a person even notice it? The cousin answered without hesitation. Nitrogen. We flood the compartment, displaces all the oxygen, puts the fire out in seconds. Julian wrote the word down and circled it 3 times. That night, he stayed up reading engineering manuals and biology PDFs. He didn't just want the name, he wanted control. He learned that pure nitrogen was colorless, odorless, and non-flammable. In a small enclosed space like an engine cab, it would displace oxygen and cause hypoxia, unconsciousness in under 60 seconds. It was silent. It left no trace. Perfect. But he still needed to test it. Julian started finding scrap metal and old canisters from the shipyard dumpsters. He told his cousin he was building a sculpture. Each visit gave him another excuse to observe procedures, take notes, even sneak supplies. After 2 weeks, he had a full sketch of how the gas worked. But sketches weren't enough. He found an abandoned freight car on a dead-end siding, no cameras, no neighbors. And there, he began to test it. Not on people, not yet. On animals. At first, it was rats from the port. He'd put them in sealed containers, monitor how long they stayed awake. Then came stray cats, then dogs. It wasn't science, it was rehearsal. Each time an animal collapsed, Julian didn't flinch. He took notes, adjusted the concentration, watched, waited, and each test made the next easier. He wasn't just studying chemistry, he was studying himself. He learned that a 2-liter canister of compressed nitrogen, released into the enclosed cab of the shunting engine, would knock out an adult male in about 75 seconds. He also built a small delivery device, no larger than a wine bottle, painted matte black, controlled remotely by a simple garage door opener. He tested it in junked cars, tweaking airflow, timing, and remote range. By the end of the 3rd week, Julian had a working system, a gas that could sedate, a machine that could deliver, and a conscience that no longer objected. But the real discovery wasn't technical, it was internal. Julian realized he could cross moral lines as long as the story in his head justified it. He wasn't hurting people. He was perfecting the plan. He wasn't torturing animals. He was eliminating uncertainty. And when he looked at Stefan's name again, he didn't see a man anymore. He saw a variable, a problem with a chemical solution. By the time Julian finished his last test, the blueprint was final. There was no more doubt, no more sketches, no more trial and error. Everything was ready. He knew exactly where he'd intercept Stefan's train, a blind curve in the yard near Junction 8, where even the Corsican lookouts couldn't see from the main office. He knew when, 2:03 a.m. on the next scheduled Tuesday run, same route, same driver, no security escort, no questions asked. He knew how. 75 seconds of nitrogen in the engine cab. Stefan would fall asleep before he even realized something was wrong. But taking out the driver was only half the job. Julian needed to move the money quietly, quickly, and without drawing attention. That meant no helicopters, no convoys, no drama, just extraction. In a rundown shed 2 kilometers from the yard, he'd hidden the next phase, a 1988 Citroën C25, a sun-bleached blue postal van, the kind of vehicle people look through, not at. Rear seats ripped out, suspension reinforced, license plates stolen from a matching junk model 2 towns away. He had test-driven it twice with full weight in the back. The postal bags of Corsican cash would fit, barely. From there, the road south would be clean. Julian had picked every turn, every gas station, every blind spot, no surveillance, no digital footprint. No one who would remember the face of a quiet man driving a forgettable van. And then, not a checkpoint, not a tunnel. Something smarter, quieter. Julian had considered driving to Italy, but that plan had holes. Border checks, police patrols, too risky. Instead, he chose a different route, the one few dared, the Calanques. 8 kilometers of sheer cliffs and tiny hidden inlets south of Marseille. He'd mapped it 24 times on foot, bought a small old fishing boat, a .2, and hidden it in a tiny forgotten cove. From there he found a sea cave, accessible only at low tide. The plan was in motion. The tools were ready. The story was perfect. Now all he had to do was press start. Julien Dubois stood alone in the shadow of a signal gantry, shrouded in wind and darkness, just beyond the curve near Junction 8. His backpack was zipped, gloves on. A standard SNCF high-visibility vest clung to his frame, stiff and freshly pressed. 2 years of planning had led to this moment. In less than an hour, he would either be a ghost with 30 million francs or a corpse at the bottom of the harbor. But the setup had begun hours earlier. At 10:12 p.m., during his regular shift, Julien had serviced the shunting engine. While Stéphane was in the break room, Julien slipped into the cab and planted the nitrogen canister under the engineer's seat, running the small clear tube up into the ventilation shaft. It took less than 2 minutes. He knew the exact spot where he'd staged the stop, a narrow, dark section of track between 2 warehouses. It was a place where GPS signals were notoriously poor and where he, as the signalman, had complete control. Rumors floated around about electrical faults in that sector, so a signal failure wouldn't raise suspicion. If anything, drivers were conditioned to wait for the signalman to fix it. Julien had chosen this place for a reason. No cameras, no overhead lights, no witnesses, just wind, steel, and routine. At 2:02 a.m., Julien arrived and began setting it all up. He didn't need cones. He had something better. He opened the trackside junction box for Section 8, a box only he had the key for, and manually tripped the relay. On the main control board, a red light began to flash. Signal fault, J8. The night supervisor sighed. "Julien, you see that? Go fix it. Bastia's special cargo is due." "On my way," Julien said into his radio, his voice calm, practiced. At 2:04 a.m., he reached into his coat and pulled out a small black remote, a repurposed diagnostic tool. He pressed the button. The GPS feed on Voiture 7 froze instantly, a digital illusion of a routine signal stop. Nothing strange, no alarms, just another blip in a sector where signals often cut out anyway. No one would question it, and that was the brilliance. 2:08 a.m. Headlights cut through the mist. The shunting engine appeared, slowing naturally at the sight of the red signal. Julien stepped forward, toolbox in hand, radio clipped to his shoulder. His vest was spotless, his posture confident. He didn't wave, didn't shout, just stood firm, like someone whose authority didn't need explaining. "Signal fault," he said, in a calm, practiced voice. Stéphane didn't question it. These stops happened. Everyone knew that. He nodded, blurry-eyed, and put the engine in neutral. Julien circled to the back of the engine, pretending to work on the junction box. He tapped the trigger in his coat pocket and began the countdown. 75 seconds. Just wind, silence, and the sound of the engine idling. At 2:10 a.m., Stéphane Joly slumped unconscious against the window. Julien moved fast. He pulled the unconscious driver into the shadows, climbed behind the wheel, and manually uncoupled Voiture 7. He climbed down, used his master key to flip the track switch, a switch that now showed green on the main board, thanks to his earlier bypass, and hot-wired a tiny electric maintenance shunter hidden on the siding. 10 minutes later, he arrived at a crumbling loading dock, barely visible from the yard, long abandoned, never recorded on manifests. Hidden behind a stack of rotting pallets was his blue Citroën van. The back was already open. The money, 20 heavy postal bags filled with 30 million francs, was stacked inside Voiture 7. Julien moved with mechanical precision, hauling them out one by one and loading them into the van. 8 minutes and 17 seconds. That's all it took. Julien returned to the engine cab and began planting evidence. A confession letter forged in Mathieu Gallo's handwriting, creased and yellowed. Bank records linking Luc Moreau to suspicious offshore deposits. A burner phone containing dozens of fake text messages between co-conspirators. The photograph of Pascal Renoir and Bastia's mistress. And tucked inside the glove compartment, a union grievance form filled out by Alain Bernard, time-stamped just 1 day before the heist, demanding access to Voiture 7's manifest. It was nothing by itself, but in a Corsican investigation, proximity was guilt. Then came the final touch. Julien leaned over Stéphane's unconscious body, which he dragged back to the tracks, and delivered a sharp blow to his nose with a wrench. Cartilage cracked, blood poured. He smeared it deliberately across the engine's control panel, a perfect trace of violence. The narrative was simple. This wasn't a lone thief. This was a multi-man inside job orchestrated by rival crews and rogue workers. And Stéphane, just a survivor in the middle of a bloody betrayal. At 2:36 a.m., Julien repositioned Stéphane in the driver's seat, reattached the GPS, removed the gas device, and disappeared into the night in his blue van, headlights off, sticking to back roads. At 2:38 a.m., Stéphane jolted awake. No memory, no money, no idea what had happened. The perfect crime was complete. By 6:30 a.m., the depot was in chaos. Bastia was screaming. Stéphane had arrived 2 hours late, dazed, with no memory and no cargo. The train was empty, except for the story Julien had planted. Mathieu's handwritten confession, a burner phone full of fabricated text messages, blood on the wheel, financial records, the photograph, the union form. At first, they thought Stéphane had double-crossed them, but the evidence told a different story, one the Corsicans found far more convincing. This wasn't a robbery. This was a conspiracy. Their internal task force got to work, interrogators trained to break men in hours, and Julien had given them everything they needed to believe the lie. The documents traced suspicious wire transfers to Luc Moreau. The phone showed encrypted chats between Alain Bernard and rival Marseille gangs. The fingerprints on the photo matched Pascal Renoir, and the confession was written in Mathieu Gallo's hand. Within 48 hours, the Corsican Mafia had issued death orders for all four: Pascal Renoir, Alain Bernard, Luc Moreau, Mathieu Gallo. And somewhere in the background, the signal man who'd framed them all was already gone. What happened next was exactly what Julien had planned, and exactly what would haunt him forever. Pascal Renoir was found first, at his mistress's apartment, shot dead at dawn. His only crime was falling in love with the wrong woman. Alain Bernard fled with his wife and 2 children to Lyon. The Corsicans found them anyway, executed the entire family as a message. Alain had never stolen anything. His wife taught school. Their children were 4 and 7 years old. Luc Moreau was captured at the train station. 3 days of torture. He broke after 18 hours, confessing to crimes he'd never committed. But in his final moments, delirious with pain, Luc whispered something important. The signal man, always watching, always there. Then Luc Moreau died. Bastia, the Corsican leader, had been listening. He began to wonder if they'd been looking in all the wrong places. The 4th conspirator, Mathieu Gallo, was found in the old port 2 nights after the heist. He was paying off his debt to the loan shark when 2 men in black jackets walked in and didn't even break stride. 3 bullets to the chest. No warning, no words. 7 people died for Julien's crime. 4 workers, 1 teacher, 2 children, all innocent, all murdered based on evidence Julien had fabricated. Meanwhile, the real perpetrator had vanished completely. At 4:42 a.m., Julien Dubois reached the edge of the Calanque, a dense stretch of cliffs outside Marseille, facing the dark Mediterranean. The sun hadn't risen yet. Fog hung low over the white rocks. This was a smuggler's corridor. unpatrolled, unlit, forgotten by design. Julien shut off the engine of his dusty blue Citroën van, rolled it off the dirt path, and buried it under a blanket of branches and camouflage netting. Inside the back, 20 postal bags packed with 30 million francs. He grabbed 2 bags, slung them over his shoulders, and began walking, 2 kilometers down the rocky path to his hidden point 2. No cameras, no drones, no witnesses. 2 hours later, he reached the sea cave, accessible only by boat. The walls sweated, but it was perfect. He locked the 2 bags inside, drank half a bottle of water, and turned back. Before dawn, he returned to the van. He repeated the same route with 2 more bags. By the time the sun rose, 4 bags, nearly 1/5 of the fortune, were hidden safely in his makeshift hideout. He slept through the day, boatless and motionless. The next night, Julien did it again. 2 trips, 2 bags each, another 4 bags moved. Now 8. It took him 5 nights. 5 nights of moving back and forth in silence by the rhythm of the tides. The last time he reached the van, he doused it in gasoline. He struck a match and tossed it. The fire swallowed the van in minutes. No license plate, no DNA, no trace. Julien turned his back on the flames and rode into the night with the final bags. All 20 bags were now safe. And Julien Dubois, he no longer existed. From now on, his name was Marc Fournier. What his neighbors didn't know was that Marc Fournier was Julien Dubois, a former signalman turned ghost, living off laundered Corsican money. The transformation had taken months of precise planning. He learned the subtleties of Portuguese culture, perfected a new backstory. The money was cleaned methodically, through Swiss proxies, offshore shell companies, and investments in a quiet Lisbon bookshop that looked perfectly mundane on paper. He bought a modest apartment, a reliable used car, enrolled in language classes, paid taxes, made friends at a quiet cafe. Nothing flashy, nothing memorable. A man engineered to disappear in plain sight. But invisibility had a price. At night he thought about Alain's children, the way Pascal's mistress had screamed when they dragged him away, the look in Luc Moreau's eyes when the Corsicans realized he wasn't guilty. Just strange. Julien hadn't just framed them. He'd written them into a death sentence. The Corsicans killed for control. Julien had killed for silence. And what haunted him wasn't just the blood. It was the simplicity. The plan had worked too well. The only thread left was the money, or rather, the lack of it. That was the only thing the Corsicans never recovered. They had suspects. They had corpses. But they never found the 30 million francs. That was the one loose end that never got tied. The one question that still echoed through Marseille's underworld. Where is the money? They never knew Julien Dubois existed, and Marc Fournier never gave them a reason to look twice. The perfect crime didn't leave witnesses. It left a question, and a man who could never answer it, even to himself.